For many people, the mere use of the word slavery can press an emotional hot button, which brooks no effort at reasonable discussion. We use the phrase slave wages to refer to low pay. We refer to being treated like a slave when asked to perform some task beneath our dignity. But it's doubtful that many people use such language with anything like a full-orbed grasp of how slavery is to be defined. It's also obvious that many critics of the Bible make little effort to define slavery before they criticize the Bible for allegedly endorsing it. What is it that defines slavery and differentiates it from any other relationship that might appear similar? Leading scholars of anthropology Levinson and Ember state that scholars have no agreement on how to define slavery, and note that the word has been used in evocative rather than in an analytical way, calling to mind a loose bundle of diagnostic features. So if scholars are still up in the air about how to define slavery, what do the critics say about it? I had a look at multiple works critical of the Bible on this point, and found that there were two leading objections to the morality of slavery. First, slavery is objectionable because it regards humans as property that can be bought and sold. Second, it is objectionable because it restrains a person against their will and without lawful authority. While some critics may believe that these 2 points offer sufficient clarification, in reality they only make the issue more complex. Take the first claim that slavery regards humans as property. The immediate and obvious problem is that the very concept of property is itself in need of definition. Levinson and Ember remark that the term property is, quote, a shorthand and abstract term for a bundle of very specific and relatively exclusive rights, unquote, held by a person in relation to another person or thing. It is also not something exclusive to what we would call slavery. In pre-colonial Africa, for example, a kinship group has the right to sell both slave and non-slave members. Philosophically, there are multiple issues with which you have to wrestle in order to define property. In fact, you can find extended philosophical discussion on what the term actually means and what rights it entails. What about the second factor, that slavery is objectionable because it restrains a person against their will and without lawful authority? Well, like the property objection, this one also immediately runs headlong into the problem of anachronism. What we today call freedom, Levinson and Ember note, is a value that only emerged in modern times. For people of many cultures, including the biblical world, it was not a question of whether you served someone else, but whom you served. Even a Roman emperor was beholden to the gods of Rome and subject to their bidding. Freedom belonged at most to supreme gods, but for humans it was a dream beyond reality. It's doubtful that critics of the Bible will make much of these distinctions concerning the terms property and freedom. For such persons, slavery is as the Supreme Court Justice Potter Stewart reputedly said of pornography, "I know it when I see it." Certainly in my review of a wide variety of critical sources, ranging from hostile scholars to amateur atheists, I found nothing in the way of a detailed discussion of concepts of property or freedom. And technically that means we could end this series right here, having shown that fundy atheists have had nothing of value to say. But since we'd like to make this a more depth educational experience, let's put on our Potter Stewart glasses when it comes to these two defining factors, and think of them in terms of strictly everyday language as we approach the question of what the Bible itself says, which we'll pick up on next time. The opening vid in our series on the Bible and slavery predictably called a few fruitcake fundy atheists out of the woodwork. Most typical was an accusation of playing semantics, though no one seemed to have any explanation for why credentialed social science scholars were wrong. The other major type of response was to haul out one of the usual passages this bunch likes to use when whining about the Bible and slavery, as if I hadn't planned to deal with them anywhere in this series. Patience apparently isn't a fundy atheist strong suit. In any event, here in Part 2 we'll lay some groundwork in which I'll explain in very general terms what my arguments will be in this series as we move forward. Keep in mind that any passage you bring up is one I've probably already dealt with in the ebook version of this series, or else I've dealt with the concepts associated with any passage you bring up, like the definitions of associated words. And with that in mind, let's have a look at our outline. Our examination of the question of slavery in the Old Testament will begin with some basics. As I stated in the outline in Part 2, what is described in much of the Old Testament is what we call indentured servitude, not slavery. In order to demonstrate this, we'll start by looking at some of the critical claims for why what we actually see is slavery. We'll begin by asking whether there are any passages which describe people as property. We'll remember that this was one of the two factors claimed to prove that the Old Testament prescribes slavery. But on what basis is it claimed that people are described as property in the Old Testament? I found that much of the arguing revolves around the use of these English words in the text. We'll leave the last two for our next vid. For right now, let's have a look at that first word by itself. The key word sometimes rendered slave reflects this Hebrew word. It appears some 800 times in the Old Testament. If a survey of translations means anything, as it often does to fundy atheists, the use of this word could reflect a point of discussion. Some, like the New International Version, render it as slave. Others, like the New American Standard Version, prefer the less offensive reading servant. Based on this, some might argue that versions like the New American Standard are trying to cover up that the Bible promotes slavery, but the reality is a little more complicated. A survey of the use of that Hebrew word indicates that while its semantic range would include such persons we'd call slaves, there is nothing about it that specifically distinguishes it as having that exclusive meaning. The word is used of kings like David to describe their relationship to Yahweh, and of prophets like Moses. It's also used of David as a vassal and mercenary of the Philistines. The Hebrew word clearly indicates some sort of subservient relationship, but the exact nature of that relationship must be established by context. And unfortunately for critics, the vast majority of uses of this word are devoid of any defining context. Take the example of Genesis 16, in which Hagar served as a handmaiden for Sarah, conceiving children for Abraham. Was Hagar considered property? Was she in the servitude relationship against her will? The text doesn't give any indication of either one, and the same may be said of the bulk of passages highlighted by critics. So in the end, are there any passages where a person is described with this word and they are regarded as property that can be bought and sold and is restrained against their will without lawful authority? In my survey of responding literature, I didn't find a single example of anyone so much as trying to argue this, except in one particular way. That's when they found the Hebrew word we've been discussing here, paired with one of the words from this duo. So that means that's where we'll have to turn, next time. As we noted in the last part of this series, there's nothing about this particular Hebrew word, the one translated variously as slave or servant, which by itself defines a person as property. Now we'll look at these two words, translated as buy and sell. So doesn't these being used of persons define those persons as property? There are only a relatively few passages that contain one of our two key words. In fact, these Hebrew words appear just over 80 times each in the Old Testament, frequently involving human subjects. As with our prior word translated as slave or servant, however, we run into a semantic puzzle. The words clearly could have the connotation of slavery, in the sense that the humans are property, but they also carry other connotations that do not imply slavery. The Hebrew word for buying is used of Eve bearing Cain, and of God's claims on heaven and earth. It is used of the purchase of a field, and of Boaz redeeming Ruth, but also of the acquisition of wisdom. So while it is clear that this word indicates some sort of relationship involving acquisition, it isn't exclusive to what we would call the purchase of property. The same could be said to a lesser extent of the word for sell. This word is more frequently used to refer to what may seem to be slave transactions, but it also is used to refer to betrayals as well as betrothals. The word therefore carries the understanding of a severing of a relationship, but not necessarily by way of ridding oneself of property. The matter has added complexity when we consider what many would no doubt consider a slam-dunk case, the use of the word to describe purchases of land. This seems straightforward until we realize that the Bible specifically attributes ownership of the land to God. The so-called buying of land, therefore, could only be the buying of rights to its use, not true ownership. It's also a little more complicated because we find in pagan records of the period, as one scholar put it, that older children were adopted by reimbursing their parents for the expenses of feeding and raising them. These transactions were recorded as if they were sales. So the question emerges, what exactly is it that is being bought and sold? Is it the person as though they were an object, or something else? That's a question we'll have to look at next time. We closed our last vid by asking a critical question. What exactly is it that is being bought and sold when these words are used of a person in the Old Testament? Is it the person themselves as though they were an object, or something else? Let's have a look at one key verse in the controversy. To many critics, the answer to the question of what is being bought and sold seems to be made clear in Exodus 21:21, which refers to a person supposed to be a slave as a master's money, or in some versions, property. The passage also raises issues of corporal punishment, but for now let's concentrate on the issue of that final word in verse 21. Does this word connote, as the modern word property does, some sort of objectification? What we find in seeking an answer is yet another puzzle. The Hebrew word in question is variously used in the Old Testament to refer to literal silver, so it cannot refer to property in the literal and material sense that we use. It's a metaphor for something else. But what exactly? Well, remember in the last vid we pointed out that God owned the land, even though the word translated buy is used to refer to human transactions with land. We should join this with the principle laid out in Leviticus 25:14-16. Here it is made clear that the actual transaction commodity isn't the land itself, but its output, or the crops. Since God owns the land, all people can really buy and sell is the land's utility. We can see the same principle applied as well in Leviticus 25:49-53. As you can see, the redemption price is based not on the person as an object, but on the person's labor output value. So in the end, there's nothing in the text that refers to humans as property, nor can this be found in any other text of the Old Testament. But we'll still have some other issues and passages to cover, certainly. Next time we'll pick up with the second part of the slavery equation, people being held against their will. See you then. Having found no evidence that people were regarded as property in the Old Testament, we now turn to the second aspect of what we today call slavery, holding a person against their will in a servitude relationship. Let's first have a look at some passages which indicate that the opposite is true of Old Testament servitude relationships. Is Old Testament servitude against the will of those who are said to be enslaved? In the background to answering this, we find that many Old Testament scholars point out that many documents that refer to the selling of persons also emphasize that the transaction is voluntary. In other words, not entered into against the will of the person, but with their will. Arguably, some might say that such statements are merely a sort of fiction, especially since they are sometimes said of infants who obviously could not have consented. But more explicit statements are also found in the Old Testament. Within that text, the clearest statement of this relationship is found in Leviticus 25:39 through 41. As you can see, it says that the person sells himself to you. In contrast, in this passage, we see that involuntary entry into servitude was strictly forbidden. Please note that the word kidnaps is the same word found in the command, "Thou shalt not steal." Likewise, here in Deuteronomy 24:7, being put into servitude against your will is also ruled out. The word slave here, by the way, is not the one we saw before in Hebrew, but this one, which means to bind, as though in sheaves. Here's another relevant text in Deuteronomy 23:15 and 16. Here again, it's not clear whether this person is considered property or is an indentured servant from the context alone. Either situation would fit this verse. So we see that the chief description of servitude in the Old Testament indicates a voluntary association, meaning it isn't what we call slavery. But there are some examples of involuntary servitude we need to talk about, which aren't slavery either. We'll pick up on that next time. Last time in this series, we discussed some passages in which involuntary servitude was indicated to be forbidden. But there are a couple of passages where it seems to be permitted or even encouraged. Let's now have a look at those. The first and simpler passage we need to deal with is Exodus 22:3. I haven't seen many critics claim that this is an example of slavery, and it clearly isn't. It's a case of a criminal being held against their will in order to pay for their crimes. In that respect, it's no more slavery than it is to hold a modern prison inmate in jail. There's a second and more complex circumstance. The key passage in this regard is Deuteronomy 20, where God gives Israel instructions on how to conduct war against foreign foes. Similar provisions were made against the Gibeonites of Joshua 9, who tricked Israel into a peace treaty. Persons so captured under a flag of truce were allowed to be put under forced labor, and Egypt's captivity of Israel would have been considered to be of the same sort of servitude. But are these people slaves? There's no indication one way or another that they were considered as property. What about restrictions on their freedom? There the answer is obviously yes, they were restricted on their freedoms. But there's a caveat. Such persons are obviously kept captive not as slaves per se, but as prisoners of war. What has to be kept in mind is that in the biblical world there were no professional armies. Every man who could see, hear, and hold a spear was a member of the military. There were no civilians as such. Even women contributed to the mechanics of war as providers of support and producers of new soldiers. And even infants were seen not as civilians, but as soldiers in waiting. If you won a war against an aggressor, what could you do to keep them from rising up against you? For most nations of this period, the only real option was conscription. This is what Egypt was doing to Israel. In their view, Israel was a foreign invader within their own boundaries. The end result in the Old Testament is something more like what we call serfdom rather than slavery. The conquered peoples kept their land, but had to pay a portion of their production, sometimes in the form of labor, towards the victorious nation. Their freedom was restricted, but that was a function of their position as prisoners of war, not as serfs or slaves. There's one other passage we'll need to deal with, one so popular that this guy repeated it about 500 times in his discussion of the Bible and slavery. Since it is so popular, we'll devote a vid to that all by itself. See you next time. When it comes to the Bible and slavery, there's one passage that fundy atheists love so much that I wonder if they sleep in pajamas decorated with it. I'm talking about Leviticus 25:42-46. For some of them, this passage ends all debate about whether the Bible anywhere endorses slavery. But what's really going on there? Initially, we can dispense with the most obvious point, which are the words slave and buy in this passage. Those are the same words we discussed before in this series, so the same answers apply. How about the word possession, which is also sometimes translated as property? That too is non-defining for slavery. In fact, it clearly isn't property ownership as we understand it, because it's the same word that is used of the land of Canaan as an everlasting possession of the Israelites, even though it is God who is said to own the land. Terminology points to some sort of rental agreement, where it is the labor output that is yours, not the person themselves. That leaves one point, the provision that one may keep such persons for life. Surely this depicts the limits on freedom that identify an institution as slavery, right? No, not at all. The defining context here is a person who has been referred to by some scholars as a temporary resident. This is a person from another nation who is living among the Israelites. But why would such a person be in Israel in the first place? Why aren't they at home? Ancient people held deep ties to their nation and family. For a person to be living among those in another nation implies that they were exiled, that they had been shamed or disgraced in their home nation and expelled. So what we have here is a person with no place to go and no recourse for returning home. In that light, the provision that one can hold them for life isn't so much an instruction as it is a permission. The Israelite servant wants to leave their servitude after 7 years because they have a home to return to, whereas the temporary resident has no such hope. So the context of the admonition then becomes, because these people have no home to return to after 7 years, their agreed upon term can be life. That pretty much diffuses the most important passage in the fundy atheist arsenal. We'll have a few more things to say about servitude in the Old Testament, though. See you next time. I couldn't close out a look at the Old Testament in this series without a few comments on the treatment accorded to those in servitude relationships. But unlike some apologists, I won't be saying much about that issue. Let me explain why. When it comes to the treatment of those in servitude in the Old Testament, some Christian apologists have taken tactical turns that I don't consider particularly productive. One of these tactics is to compare Old Testament text to contemporary pagan law codes, and say, look how much better and more moral the Old Testament is. Without disparaging such efforts, I have to say that they have a certain weakness inherent in them. It has to do with a quote I once noted from a book called Covenant, The History of a Biblical Idea. What this means in practical terms is that we may be comparing apples to oranges when we compare the Old Testament to, say, the Law of Hammurabi. Exodus 21, 1-6 says that those in servitude may be kept for 6 years, but must be released in the 7th year. The law of Hammurabi lays out a term of 3 years, with release in the 4th year. Critics working under our assumption of improvement will easily say that it's better to offer a term of 3 years rather than 6. But based on what Hiller says, no one was consulting the law of Hammurabi when they wanted to know how long they were allowed to keep their servants indentured. It's not like that code, or Exodus and Deuteronomy for that matter, was kept on a shelf and pulled down whenever a legal question arose. The main purpose, rather, was exemplary and didactic. Neither of the passages in question was meant to provide an absolute statement of the term of a servant which brooked no exceptions. In all likelihood, the terms of service varied according to the debt owed. For that reason, I prefer not to use a comparative approach like that one. The laws simply don't tell the whole story. I said there were 2 tactical turns. The second one relates to a chief objection concerning the use of corporal punishment, as exemplified by Exodus 21:20. I won't discuss this too much because the matter of corporal punishment isn't a unique function of servitude relationships in the biblical world. Even students who were the children of wealthy parents could find themselves subject to beatings by their teachers. Some critics render particularly harsh judgments on this because they think it allows masters to beat slaves up to a certain point and then stop. But I have to ask how a person can become knowledgeable enough to gauge that they have beaten a person to just the right condition, where they will get up after a day or so without dying. But, as credible scholars tell us, the purpose of this law is rather different. I'll deal with one more commonly objected to passage before leaving the Old Testament behind. Then we'll be on to the New Testament. See you next time. To round off our look at the Old Testament, we'll check out one other passage that's a frequent target of critics, one which is said to exemplify the cruelty of Old Testament servitude. The rule offered here in Exodus 21:4 is sometimes referenced as unusually cruel because it forces a husband to leave behind a wife and children he loved. Initially, we might reply that this argument imposes modern ideas of marriage relationships on the text. In the biblical world, marriages were always arranged. There was no such thing as dating or getting to know each other. What we call love in a marriage was a rarity, as were intimate relationships in non-physical terms. In that light, it won't be surprising to learn that arrangements like the one described in Exodus 21:4 were more like business relationships, in which, for example, the servant was mated with a foreign bondwoman in order to produce children, who would later serve as servants. Or, since both the man and his wife were indentured, they might pool resources to pay off their debts earlier. Emotional ties between the man and his family would exist rarely, if at all. That said, if some sort of emotional bond did occur, that is indeed what the pledge and ritual of the passage is for, as the man could stay part of the master's household. He could undergo a simple ritual, in which his ear was pierced with an awl, a method no more painful or cruel than what is experienced at mall jewelry kiosks in this country on a daily basis. Alternatively, the man could work on his own and buy the freedom of the wife and children. The former decision meant less risk and more security, and would have been the preferred choice in a society without modern concepts of individual freedom. On the other hand, it should be noted that with the sort of gifts such a servant would be provided on his departure, he would already be on his way to being able to pay the price of redemption for his wife and children. In the end, the situation described by Exodus 21:4 relates to cultural values we don't share today, in which debts were taken far more seriously, and the shame of being indebted to others was a heavier burden than the debt itself. That closes our look at the Old Testament. We'll be back next time with the start of the New Testament analysis. See you then. When it comes to the New Testament, there's a significant paradigm shift in our discussions. Slavery practiced in the Greek and Roman world of the New Testament was, indeed, slavery as we understand it, and as scholars define it. It was not the same in all of its elements as New World slavery, but in the two most essential traits we have discussed, treatment of humans as property and complete restriction of freedom, it's a match. The grounds of discussion therefore shifts to moral questions. Why did the authors of the New Testament not loudly call for an end to slavery? Why did Jesus not address the issue? Why did the New Testament authors simply take for granted that slavery was part of their world? Our answer to these questions may not satisfy everyone, but if you lived in their world, we can pretty much guarantee that you'd be using the same answer. And that is that direct opposition to slavery would have been an ineffective and counterproductive means of addressing the issue. The problem was far more than the institution. It was also the attitudes of people towards the institution and its participants. Before the action could be stopped, hearts had to be changed. A direct appeal to end slavery would have fallen on deaf ears, and the appellants would have died with no change made for the better. I like to draw an analogy between the relative effectiveness of two chief civil rights leaders of the 20th century, Malcolm X and Martin Luther King. King, like Gandhi, advocated a form of passive resistance as a means of protest. Malcolm X, in contrast, for most of his career, advocated a more direct and sometimes violent approach to social change. Ask which is considered to have been the more effective leader, and few will deny that King takes the crown. As we'll see in vids following, the New Testament took a King approach to slavery, recognizing and dealing with it as a reality, but also laying the groundwork for a change of heart about the people who participated in it, in a way that ultimately, if followed, would have undermined the very basis for slavery and destroyed it from within. We introduced this section of our series by laying out the premise that there were certain attitudes about slavery ingrained in the social world of the New Testament that would have made a direct approach to ending it impossible. In this vid, we'll explain what those attitudes were and give you an idea what the authors of the New Testament would have been up against had they gone straight abolitionist. A direct attack on slavery as an institution would have been made essentially impossible, because it was assumed that the state of being a slave was a natural one. The juxtaposition of slave and free was seen as being as basic as the division between male and female. Let's have a look at what a few scholars have to say about this issue. Reinforcing the idea of slavery as a fixture was a widespread perception of slaves as worthy of being enslaved. Slaves were regarded as lazy and immoral, which made it all the easier to treat them as subhumans. Here's another sampling from scholars. I'll close this by making the point that critics are hard-pressed to find anything like abolitionist sentiments anywhere in the New Testament world. One critic argued that there were a couple of Greek regions, Phocis and Locris, that were supposed to have forbidden slavery. But this claim was made in 1939 and has been more recently open to doubt. In particular, it has been argued that if there were no slaves in these regions, it may be because, as was the case in certain American territories, it wasn't economically practical. In the end, you won't find any precedent for abolition of slavery in this period, which is a sure sign that other means had to be tried to undermine that institution. We'll discuss how the New Testament did it next time. As we've said, the New Testament took an approach to slavery which undermined its premises rather than directly attacking it. It's all well to say that the authors of the New Testament should have said something about treating humans with dignity. But what if the real problem was that slaves were regarded as less than human? Slavery in the New Testament era was justified by the powers in charge, with suppositions that slaves were in some way of a lower class than masters. This was the bad attitude that needed to be counteracted before direct commands against slavery could be effective. To that end, we find passages like these which indicate that one's identity as a slave, or as a free person, is subsumed under unity in Christ, where all are equal. To the modern reader, this may seem like no big deal. But in the first century world, these would describe a radical concept of equality under Christ, which supplanted what were previously some of the most important social distinctions of the New Testament world. In that way, they subverted and undermined the assumptions that made slavery ideologically possible. Just as subtle but even more important is the fact that in the New Testament, as one scholar puts it, terms referring to slaves or to their nature are never used in a derogatory manner. No generalizations, positive or negative, are made on the character of slaves, as was usual for Greek and Roman literature. Furthermore, it is noticeable that slaves are not to be treated in any way as second-class Christians. They are assumed to participate in the Christian life on equal footing with the free person, which is a significant departure from the conceptions of the time. A related question on this matter is, why didn't Jesus condemn slavery himself? Well, apart from what we've said in prior sections about how a direct condemnation would have been fruitless, we may add that 99.9% of the people Jesus met were poor rural peasants who could not own slaves. Had he condemned slavery, he would be condemning an institution in which nobody hearing him at the time would have been a participant. In other words, he had the wrong audience. Even so, there is one critical text that foreshadows the other texts we've highlighted. In Mark 10:44, Jesus tells his disciples that whoever wants to be first must be slave of all. As scholar Jennifer Glancy observes, the slaveholding ethos was predicated on control and honor. By calling on his followers to become slaves of all, Jesus emptied the ethos of its power. These few short words may not seem like much, and critics would probably prefer an extended discourse from Jesus or Paul giving masters a slapdown. But what the New Testament does offer is more effective than direct approaches, in light of those bad attitudes that permeated the world of the New Testament. Talk of treating slaves with human dignity wouldn't work if masters were convinced that slaves were less than human. That's how the New Testament subverted slavery from within. But some may say, what about passages like these? Don't these endorse slavery? No, not at all, and we'll talk about how that's so next time. Critics make much of New Testament admonitions to slaves, which tell them to be obedient. Some say that these admonitions amount to an endorsement of slavery. But what's really going on? Initially, a question we can ask is, what exactly could Paul have instructed slaves to do, other than obey their masters? Obey them only partly? Only 10% of the time? Not at all? If Paul had said nothing, critics would still complain, so what's left? And if Paul and the other New Testament authors had said to disobey masters, they would have brought those slaves, and probably others like them, their own signed death warrant. Yes, Paul instructs slaves to obey masters, but that's not the same thing as approving of slavery as an institution. Rather, it's a frank recognition of its immovable reality. By comparison, a hostage negotiator may advise a hostage to speak respectfully to their captor, but this does not equate with an endorsement of kidnapping. We might further point out that any suggestion to disobey masters might have only had an effect if the master was under Paul's authority, that is, if they were a Christian. A non-Christian master certainly wouldn't obey Paul, and a Christian slave certainly can't do anything to make it happen. That said, what we do find is the same proclivity to undermine as we find in the rest of the New Testament. Notice that in Ephesians 5:21, Paul instructs the Ephesians to submit to one another. That would include masters submitting to slaves. This instruction would be in complete contradiction to values associated with slavery. Further, notice what is said in advice given to masters. They are told to forbear threatening because they have a master in heaven. The use of threats was critical to the function of slavery, and was the initial way in which the superior-inferior relationship was established. By nature, it would have had to include both verbal and physical threatening. Paul has told slaves to be obedient, but he has also taken the means to compel obedience out of the master's hands. I couldn't close out an analysis of slavery in the New Testament without a look at a recent analysis by a scholar whom we've quoted here favorably. Jennifer Glancy's Slavery in Early Christianity is overall a careful and detailed scholarly work that offers sometimes neglected insights into ancient Roman slavery. But Glancy says some things about the use of slaves for sexual purposes that deserves our attention. As you might suppose, Roman masters were known to make use of their slaves for sexual purposes. How often this happened and in what context is not something we can readily say. But Glancy believes it happened often enough that the New Testament ought to have said something about it, and she has some misgivings about the fact that it doesn't. From a moral perspective, I can understand Glancy's concerns, but there are a few points to consider. Mid-first century churches were not so large that it was even close to guaranteed that they would have among their number confessing Christian masters who sexually used their slaves and would need correction. It's more likely, on the other hand, that there were some slaves in the church that were being so used by their non-Christian masters, and Glancy more than once speculates that there may have been some problem with such slaves participating in Christian fellowship. Or, as she puts it, Paul's teachings on sexuality would have complicated and even barred the participation of many slaves in Christian life. But that's far from certain. First of all, if such slaves did exist in the church, it's hardly likely that they were putting their troubles out on Front Street, advertising that their masters shamed them in such a profoundly embarrassing way. So someone like Paul, or a church leader, would be unlikely to be put into the position of making decisions about such a person. But even if they were, such a slave would have been understood by Paul and other Christians to have been raped by their non-Christian master, if they were not willingly participating in the sexual acts. After all, the slave was subject to coercion in the matter, and could no more be charged with sin than a person who had been robbed or murdered. But again, I rather expect the chances that Paul even did run into such a situation were rather small. And furthermore, had he done so, he would have done it years before the New Testament letters when he first encountered those churches. Clancy also makes much of 1 Thessalonians 4:3-8, and Paul's advice that each should seek his own vessel. She rejects the idea that it refers to a spouse, and suggests that it was Paul making leeway for the acquisition of a slave with which one could enjoy sexual relations. Paul, however, was writing his letter to the entire Thessalonian congregation, not merely males with enough resources to own slaves. The recipients of the letter would have included slaves, as well as poorer persons unable to purchase or support slaves. Yet Paul's advice is to each man or person, not merely those who might be able to own slaves. By Clancy's reading, Paul must assume that poor people and slaves can also buy their own sexual slaves or vessels. Clancy is also aware that it can be argued that commands against fornication would exclude Christian masters from having sex with their slaves. This argument she tries to subvert with a loophole. Maybe, she suggests, Paul didn't understand it that way, and sex with slaves wasn't fornication since they were property. But again, she relies heavily on an understanding that the word vessel refers to some inanimate, morally neutral object like a slave. Clancy tries to block off the reference as being to spouses, particularly wives, by saying that it is not a particularly dignified reference to women. But other uses of the same word inform the matter better. In Romans 9:22-3, Paul uses the same word to refer metaphorically to what could only be all humans, regardless of gender or status. Likewise in 2 Corinthians 4:7. In 2 Timothy 2:21, the word is used of men's bodies only. 1 Peter 3:7, though it refers to women as the weaker vessel, if we are to take the comparative seriously, indicates that men too are vessels. In 1 Timothy 1:10, the Apostle Paul lists several types of evil people. Among them are man-stealers, which is understood to refer to those who kidnap others to sell them into slavery. Of course, this would exclude much of what supplied Roman slavery, prisoners of war. But Paul here does forbid the kidnapping of free persons to be sold as slaves, which means this verse by itself destroys the premises that stood behind American slavery. In spite of clear instructions like this, American slaveholders came up with all kinds of excuses why verses like these didn't apply to their situation. Some time ago we previewed this series with a quote from scholar Mark Knoll, which explained the difference between pro-slavery exegetes and abolitionist exegetes. American slaveholders then treated the Bible like modern fundy atheists. They tended towards the idea that the plain reading of the text was the most exegetically sound, and they created forced interpretations to excuse away passages like 1 Timothy 1:10. In the next few vids, we're going to have a look at how two sides of the American slavery debate handled certain critical passages. As we'll see, when it comes to the pro-slavery exegetes, the results would indeed have been comic if in fact the living results had not been so tragic. Let's meet the four representatives of the debate, two from each side, who served as our sources for upcoming debate material. One of the most critical passages in the arsenal of pro-slavery American writers was this one, Genesis 9:25 through 27. If you've never heard of the idea before, you may wonder what it has to do with slavery in America. You're right, it has nothing to do with it. But pro-slavery authors performed a series of exegetical gymnastics to get it there. Let's have a look at how. The sum of how this passage was used amounts to this. White people in America were understood to be descendants of Noah's son Japheth. Persons of African descent were considered to be descendants of Ham. Therefore, they reasoned, descendants of Japheth had a right to enslave descendants of Ham. Now, you don't need to be paying too close attention to catch the obvious problem. It wasn't Ham's descendants this prediction was made about. It was Canaan's. And if you take the Bible's record at face value, as both sides of this debate did, you'd have to explain how you get out of this a justification for slavery of African peoples, seeing as how Canaan is way over here outside of Africa. As a way to explain this, some pro-slavery exegetes resorted to all kinds of wacky extra-biblical speculation with no grounds in evidence. One such argument made was that maybe the Canaanites later moved to Africa and became the Africans they knew of in the 19th century. Another suggestion was that sometime later, Noah also cursed Ham the way he did Canaan. We just don't know about it. Maybe the worst explanation of all was one where pro-slavery writers basically argued in a circle, saying that the very fact that the African peoples were now enslaved proved that they must have been descended from Canaan. So you can see that it didn't take much or very long for pro-slavery writers to leave the Bible behind and run to extra-biblical speculations or arguments. Did they ever actually stick with the Bible when it came to this passage? Yes, in one instance, but even then, what they did only further demonstrated their dishonesty. One of their arguments was that some versions of Genesis have Ham as the subject rather than Canaan. A certain Bishop Newton was referred to as having found this variant in the Arabic version of Genesis, as well as in some copies of the Greek Old Testament. The ultimate rebuttal to this idea is found in this work, David Mark Whitford's The Curse of Ham in the Early Modern Era, but let's sum up the findings on this point. Basically, this Bishop Newton ignored some crucial information, particularly that the Arabic Genesis was a 9th century product, while 4 earlier versions, including the Greek Old Testament and the Latin Vulgate, read the same way our modern English versions do. It's true that a few copies of the Greek Old Testament have Newton's preferred reading. Actually, only 8 copies, and none of those are from earlier than the 12th century. In terms of textual criticism, this one's supremely bogus, and obviously so. Any slaveholder who thought that this was a valid argument that defeated abolitionists, or that Genesis 9:25 through 27 supported their views, obviously didn't have the rules of evidence on their mind. And we'll see how that's so in further examples in this series. I noted last time how badly pro-slavery authors abused Genesis 9:25 through 27. Let's now take a look at two other major abuses of theirs from the Old Testament. As you might expect, one of the biggest arguments made by pro-slavery authors went like this. People in the Old Testament like Abraham had slaves. Having slaves was even allowed in the law. Therefore, we can have slaves too. I'm sure that sounds familiar, and you know what kind of people make that argument today. It sure isn't scholars. In the 19th century, not as many scholars responded to this argument by pointing out that the Old Testament actually depicted indentured servitude, as we've said. Some scholars had an idea about that, but a far more popular abolitionist response was to gig pro-slavery authors with the 19th century version of the Dr. Laura letter. Basically, that means they'd say in reply, if you guys are so gung-ho about the Old Testament, how come you're not eating kosher or keeping concubines? And more to the point, why are you ignoring various rules about treating your servants well, such as the requirement that you release a slave who had lost an eye or a tooth? Or what about the rule about releasing them after 6 years? The way pro-slavery authors responded to these criticisms was quite comical. In one case, one of them did a bait-and-switch, claiming that slaves from Africa ought to be equated with the foreign servants referred to in Leviticus. But note that those persons are called strangers that do sojourn among you. The analogy would hold if African persons immigrating to America were to become slaves. Other than that, though, they pretty much ignored the problem, which was probably their best option. One other argument I'll highlight will sound familiar also, because it's still used by fundy atheists today. Pro-slavery writers made light of the 10th commandment. They engaged this passage for the sake of a massive non sequitur. First, servants are listed with houses and donkeys and oxen. Second, donkeys and oxen were property. Therefore, they must all be considered property, which makes slavery acceptable. As I told fundy atheists who raised this one against prior vids in the series, this is an obvious category fallacy. The presence of two objects in the same list does not mean all the items share the same properties. That would be like saying that listing soap on a grocery list with beans and rice makes soap into food. I like something else an abolitionist said in reply to this misuse of the 10th commandment. It was pointed out that by the same logic, this makes wives property too. As we know, fundy atheists have indeed taken the 10th commandment to that conclusion, which is illogical for the same reason. But pro-slavery writers were in even more of a bind, since they were supposed to be obeying the 10th commandment. Tellingly, one of them took the bait and decided that wives actually were property. I don't think I'd want to be that guy when he got home. We've already seen some clear examples of how pro-slavery authors misused the Old Testament. Now let's see some examples of how they misused the New Testament. And you won't get any points for saying they screwed that up too. We reflected earlier in this series on the relative silence of Jesus regarding slavery. As you might expect, like today's fundy atheists, pro-slavery writers took this silence as a ringing endorsement. Abolitionists responded pretty much the same as we did, pointing out that there were few or no slaves in Judea at the time of Jesus, and that most of his audience would not have owned slaves. Pro-slavery writers engaged their usual comic talents in reply to this point. One argued that slavery must have existed at the time of Jesus because Jews still had slaves hundreds of years earlier, at the time of Ezra, so they must not have gotten tired of it yet. But that's a bit of a strain. Ezra's account does refer to servants of some sort, but there's no context to tell us whether these servants were hired, or slaves, or clients in a patronage contract. Given that Israel had itself been in exile just shortly before, that these may have been slaves may be seriously questioned. And even so, regardless of what happened in Ezra's time hundreds of years before, we remain sure that by Jesus' time, there was no serious slavery of any sort among the Jews, and what little there may have been would have been restricted to the 1% of the day, a very small and wealthy class with enough resources to purchase slaves. It gets worse, though, as this particular exegete, Mr. Stringfellow, used Jesus' silence as an excuse to claim that Jesus actually did say something positive about slavery. This is how his argument is made with reference to 1 Timothy 6. Here Stringfellow is compelled to admit that he is inventing the notion of an unquoted statement of Jesus on the subject of slavery, which would be impossible if slavery did not exist in Judea among the peasants who were Jesus' chief adherents. But what Stringfellow purposely obscures is that verse 3 comes after an extended number of teachings, including many that we have nothing from Jesus on, such as the disposition of young widows. If Stringfellow is right, 1 Timothy 6:3 compels us to suppose that there were a host of unattested statements of Jesus. However, in reality, it's better to see the reference to the teachings of Jesus as a "this too." In other words, Paul is telling Timothy to have others adhere to the teachings that Paul himself has laid out, along with the teachings of Jesus. There was a particularly good argument made by abolitionists in response to pro-slavery writers who appealed to New Testament slavery, as well as Genesis 9 and the curse on Canaan. The latter, as we noted, was used by pro-slavery authors to justify their right as descendants of Japheth to supposedly enslave descendants of Ham. But in the New Testament world, what we would have had was mostly people considered descendants of Japheth enslaving each other. That led to an obvious question. What would keep someone like Drizzler from enslaving someone, say, like Hopkins? Yeah, they didn't know what to say about that either. We've now come to a close of our series on Scripture and slavery, leaving a few points in conclusion. One of the first things I said in this series was that I found nothing in the way of serious arguments by any critic of the Bible on this issue. I found no effort to define terms, or to understand the social world of the Bible, or to critically compare the arguments of slavery proponents with those of abolitionists. In most cases, all I found was one soundbite after another, with the same arguments being ground out by every source. The example of Scripture and slavery is a demonstration that no serious approach to the biblical text relies on straight quotation, followed by simplicity of attitude. Some funny atheists claim to take the Bible seriously, but the day that they do that is the day that Thornton Stringfellow sells ice cream at Baskin-Robbins. I'd really like to see some funny atheists at least try to do something a little more sophisticated, like come to grips with definitions of critical words and concepts, like freedom and property. But, in the end, the day that that happens will also be the day that, yeah, exactly.